Well, quick survey for us this morning. If you've lived in another country, please raise your hand. I'd love to get it. Wow.
How long?
For how long? Just quickly. Oh, just lived in another country. You've resided in another country. Wow, that's like half of us. That's amazing. Okay, that's a little bit surprising.
Wales.
Wales. Wales is another country. So that does count. So you would know some of this. For those of you who haven't moved, do consider what it would take for you to move to another country. Take a moment and consider that. Maybe consider the things that did cause your move to the other country. And now back to the land of milk and honey. So I attended 6 different schools in my schooling time. I lived in 7 different countries, did 7 intercontinental moves, and then the biggie, I did 33 house moves. So from my somewhat experience, allow me to offer as fact that in all moves, there are push factors and there are pull factors. If you've done the moves, you'll know what I'm talking about. Push factors and pull factors that help and make decisions, kind of these big decisions. So let's see if we can rattle off. What are a couple of the push factors that people have experienced in making move decisions? Push factors, things that push you out from where you are to another place, another country. Weather. Yes. Spain. New job, yeah. Work, yeah. Crime, yeah. Environment, retirement, yes. Family, yeah, totally. New experiences, yeah. Finances. So let's think. What are some of the biblical push moments that we can think of out of scriptures? Just try and come up with a couple. Let's think. Some of the push moments. Persecution. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Famine. Yeah, so kind of Joseph and his family coming down into Egypt. Slavery is a push factor. Yeah, getting away from slavery. Totally. I'm thinking of Jesus fleeing to Egypt to try and get away from Herodian baby killing sprees. Cool. Let's think about some pull factors. Let's think of some of the real life pull factors that draw us somewhere. The weather, exactly.
That's all we care about.
So why are we all here? Let's not go there. Opportunity. Yep. Getting married. Yeah. Follow the boy, follow the girl. Yep. Yeah. Good education. Cheltenham is a biggie for that one. We love living here because of the wonderful opportunities. You think if I can see any others that I'd written down. Good living standards. To be closer to family and friends. So sometimes family or friends are a push factor. Let's get away. I moved away from home a little bit to try and, because it was a push factor. But sometimes it can be a pull. We want to be closer to family and friends. Let's think of a couple of biblical pull moments. Because clearly one of the pulls is when God calls as well. For us, we've done five house moves and 3 countries because of the pull of God calling us. So let's think of a couple of biblical pull factors. Pull moments. Mission. Yeah, like Acts, kind of the mission of God. Paul being called to the Gentiles, totally. Freedom. Yeah, freedom out of slavery. Yeah. Church planting, totally. Yeah. Abraham, God says, I'll take you to a land that I will yet show you. I mean, that's some That's some serious faith and some serious pull factor needed there. And so that's good. You know, the reality, I think as we go through this process, we realize that it doesn't matter how rooted or unrooted you might feel right now. You could possibly foresee a situation where you are able to move and be flexible and do something in following these push and pull factors, right? So even if you haven't moved, you could go, yeah, I could see that as a possible reason. This morning, we're going to continue from the sermon that Howard brilliantly kicked us off last week. We're going to continue our series in looking at Ezra and Nehemiah, returning and rebuilding. And we're going to we're going to be looking at the three major return events from the Babylonian exile back to the land of Judah, the Judean countryside, and the capital city, Jerusalem. And we're going to allow the scriptures to hopefully ask the same questions of us as it did of the people 2,500 years ago. And we try and apply that to our time here and now, which is, let's face it, unique. So the question is, of course, and let's hope we can roll it. Any moment now.
Should I stay or should I go?
You were waiting for that, surely. Thanks, Graham. That's a toughie. Should I stay or should I go? Okay, so that's where the big questions of life that we're going to be pondering this morning. So let's recap from last week a little bit about the three major exile events, because the exile events, the ways and the rhythms by which they were taken to exile almost informs the way in which they return. So even in the fact that there are three exile big moments under the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. So like Howard, I love a little bit of facts. I'll geek out a little bit. So between 612 and 605 BC, the Assyrians are pretty much destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And interestingly, their allies, the Assyrian allies, the Egyptians, also get defeated militarily during this period. And it's the end of their great reign of the pharaohs of old. It's the end for them. And so initially, the Babylonians had a really generous kind of foreign policy when dealing with the nations that they're occupying and conquering. And they kind of let people be until there was a bit of unrest. And that's what then happens in 605 BC. The first thing that the Babylonians do is they come in and they take the top off the ruling class of the Judean life of Jerusalem. So they take the king, they take the court, and they deport all of them into Babylon and into the countryside of Babylon. Okay, so without leaders, without kings, without rulers, the Judeans are going to be impotent. They're not going to be able to do much, is the thinking. Or at least politically, that's their hope. But the Jews always find a way, and they start getting restless again in Jerusalem and in Judea. And so let me just quickly mention, as part of the 605 exile of the ruling class, Daniel is taken. So when we read the book of Daniel, we think this is the first group of exiles that's taken. And that's kind of 70 years that Jeremiah prophesies. It's the beginning of the 70 years that they say this will be the minimum period that you have to live in exile. So it's a critical moment, that 605. But trouble persists, okay? Even though the ruling class and the leaders are gone. And again, in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he takes away all the skilled laborers, all the craftsmen, all the priests, and the Levites, and he takes them into Babylon. So now they can't run an economy. They've got no skilled craftsmen to do life. And they're hoping that by doing that, they'll sort of squash the rebellion that the Judeans seem to always crop up with. And as part of this is Ezekiel. So when Ezekiel lives and prophesies, he's speaking into this Babylonian period of exile. And, the dry bones and all. That is just exciting stuff that he sees prophetically about that time period. But again, the Jews continue in Judea and in Jerusalem, and finally Nebuchadnezzar, in 586, he comes, he squashes the temple, flattens it. It's the destruction of the first temple of Solomon. He smashes the city of Jerusalem, smashes the walls, and it is, to all intents and purposes, a dead city. And Judea is empty. They do large-scale deportations into the lands of Babylon and all around the kingdom of Babylon to get rid of this group of troublemakers. So in these three exiles, we see in the first one, there's a destruction of the social life, where the leadership, the kings are taken away. The second exile, there's this destruction of the ability to do life and economy through the skills, but also worship life is completely altered. There are no more priests around to worship and to bring sacrifices in the temple. It's all gone. They've all been taken in exile. And thirdly, with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, finally, it's the destruction really of life, of the ability to do practical life. Without a wall, you can't live. You can't survive in a city like that. So really, within the sovereignty of God, we're not surprised that there are three major return events that not kind of tit for tat cover all three of these points, but within them, they cover all three of these points. And that is really quite interesting to see. And the first one, under Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, the guys we heard about last week, in 539, so the first return, there's a restoring of the ruling class and some leadership wattage. Zerubbabel was a direct descendant of the last king of Judah in Jerusalem, Jehoiakim. And so Zerubbabel, interestingly, he's mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. He's part of the direct line of Jesus, which I think is quite fascinating. Most of us don't read the genealogies in Matthew 1 particularly closely, but maybe next time you will. And look up this guy. And so during the first return, they build an altar, they sacrifice to God. It's the first thing they do when they arrive back in Jerusalem. They start the foundations of the temple. Great celebration. It's fantastic. And eventually it takes the prophetic preaching of Ezekiel and Haggai to help get the temple finished, because there's resistance from the Samaritans, and let's face it, a bit of laziness had crept in as well. So 20 years later, the temple is finished. Under Ezra, in 548 BC, there's a return of the fullness of temple worship, because Ezra goes and he brings 1,800 Levites and priests back into Jerusalem. It took him a while. He had to really go and dig around. And he brings them back into Jerusalem so that there's a fullness of the priestly service and worship that can take place in the temple, which is wonderful. Then also, he brings back this wonderful thing that had been lacking for so long, which is scripture reading of the Torah. And then finally, under Nehemiah in 445, there's a restore of the practical life, because he gets a mandate to come and rebuild the city walls. So let's read extracts from Ezra and Nehemiah, and let's see if we can spot the catalyst events. What are the push and pull factors that brings about this major return in these three events back to Jerusalem and to Judea? So in Ezra 1, which is the first return under Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar, it says, "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah," right, remember, might be fulfilled, "the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia." So that, that's remarkable. "So that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his peoples, may his God be with him. And let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. I mean, that's remarkable from a Persian king, from Cyrus. Then the second return, with Ezra, we start with Ezra 7. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. Interesting phrase, keep listening out for it. For Ezra has set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law, blah-de-blah, peace. And now I make a decree that anyone of the people of Israel, or their priests or Levites in my kingdom, remember under him, the priests and the Levites are rounded up and returned, who freely offers to go to Jerusalem may go with him. Okay? And he finishes, this is Ezra's response to this declaration from Artaxerxes, verse 27. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing in the hearts of the king, to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, and who extended to me his steadfast love before the king and his counselors. And before all the king's mighty officers, I took courage, for the hand of the Lord my God was on me. And I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me. And they do, 1,800 of them. Then finally, the Nehemiah return, 445 BC. Nehemiah 1. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And Nehemiah then, who's the cupbearer of King Artaxerxes, he's clearly bothered by this deeply. And he's supposed to be smiling all day in front of the king, but he's carrying this massive burden. And Artaxerxes says to him, Nehemiah, what's up? And he fires off this lovely little bullet prayer, oh God, help me. And then he talks to the king. And the king responds and gives him a letter and does everything that Nehemiah asks for. And his final response is, and the king granted me what I had asked for the good hand of my God was upon me. And it's clear that from all three, these major returns from exile to Jerusalem, they share a common theme. And that theme is that God stirs the hearts of man. God stirs the hearts of man. In the first and second returns, God stirs the heart of the Persian kings, Cyrus and then Artaxerxes. And in the third return, God stirs the heart of a Hebrew serving in the king's court, Nehemiah. Stirred. God can be the stirring behind many of the push and pull factors in life. And when we consider these big choices, these big decisions that we take, when it comes to moving somewhere or staying somewhere or job we do or the schools we have our children attend or the family decisions we make, my experience, maybe this is yours as well, is that it's not only God. A lot of that is me and my personal kind of internal voice that is very loud at times. And that's not necessarily bad when it's our personal preferences that shape our decisions. God has given us the nations to work in, the nations to live in, the nations to be a blessing to and to make disciples in. And He's given us minds and brains and intellect, and He's given us personalities with preferences, and He's given us resources to help us fill the earth with the knowledge of the glory of God. And so as we do lives, as we do everyday life, this mandate happens. We do spread the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. But what is critical for us as followers of Christ, if you're a guest this morning and you wouldn't yet consider yourself a follower of Jesus, this is what it means for us to be followers of Christ. When God does speak, when He does stir, when He does lead and prompt us, we then follow. We then obey. And not then in that moment do our own thing or our own preference, right? What's interesting, sad even, is in the returns highlighted by Ezra and Nehemiah, is that there are many who return, but there are many who never return. Those who didn't respond to God's stirring to return back from exile, back to Jerusalem and to Judea, have been mostly lost to history. Those who stayed in Babylon, you can imagine what happens. If we move to Glasgow, how long will it be before you're just Glaswegian? It's not long. And your kids will speak Glaswegian, and quickly, you're just Glaswegian. Well, those who stayed in Babylon, they intermarry with Babylonians, with unbelievers, maybe some with local Jews who also remain behind. They continue their lives, they continue their jobs, and being separated from a functioning community of God, their religious identity and religious fervor eventually fizzles out, and they just get sucked into the culture of Babylon, and they vanish to history. And those who remained in the land during the exiles, who remained in Judah, who remained in that sort of part of the Middle East, well, they largely became the Samaritan peoples. And we've already heard a little bit about the Samaritans because they caused some trouble in the rebuilding of the temple to such a point that it had to stop. And these Samaritans, with this hybrid kind of Jewish, Gentile mix of people who had a little bit of everything. And I think it's fascinating that in Jesus' time, his very first kind of missions trip he takes is to Samaria. If you think the Samaritan woman at the well, the story of living waters flowing out and Jesus telling her everything she's ever done. You remember that story? It's the first missions trip Jesus takes with his disciples. Is to go and demonstrate love and grace to these wayward and hated people. And I think it's fascinating. Also, the Good Samaritan? Nah, how is that possible? To the Jews, Samaritans, literally, they did that. They were hated. Okay? And this is where, it's during this time period that this animosity develops. So it seems that it's only the people who responded to God's stirring and his call to return and come and rebuild that go on to any lasting significance as the people of God. And if you are a follower of Jesus, I genuinely have no doubt that without anybody having told you, God has been stirring us. That all of us know we are living in a very significant moment in history as believers. Under normal times, where we live or don't live, or the job we do or don't do, or the schools or the car we drive, these things are neutral. They're neutral at best in the kind of economy of God. No problem. Choose that or that. It's fine. God's with you. But these are not common times. And we are not Babylonians. I think globally and uniquely and individually, God is speaking to the churches and the people of God right now. And he's stirring us. He's stirring the churches to return. He's calling them home. He's calling us home. In so many ways, it feels like we've been living in exile, haven't we? These past 14 months. Exiled from genuine community with the people that we love. I mean, genuinely, a screen is not community, no matter what you tell me. Oh, but we've made do with what we had. We've been exiled from learning together. We've been exiled from worshiping together. Exiled from the mission of God. Exiled from praying together. Exiled from making disciples in the way that we'd love to be able to do. We've felt distance, if we're honest with ourselves, even at times exiled from God because of these factors. But graciously and gently, God seems to be wooing us, calling us back. The God of all history, who holds in his hands Samaritan challenges, Babylonian kings, and pandemics, he is stirring us and calling us, his people, to return and rebuild. So what is God stirring us to return from? What is he calling us to return from? I think in Babylon, the main reason people chose not to return back to Judea and to Jerusalem, but to rather stay, was because they'd grown. What had they grown? Comfortable. They'd grown comfortable. Babylon wasn't like Egypt. Exile is not slavery. There is a significant difference between the two. They had homes. They had jobs. They had Babylonian friends and neighbors. They knew where the shortcuts were to get to places. They knew where the best shops were. They even knew culturally that when you stop when you're at a traffic light, particularly there in Cleve, at the rugby club, you don't use the right-hand lane because people are going to think you're pushing in, and nobody likes that in this country. And I'm upsetting people non-stop because of that. But they learned, you don't do that. They can coexist with their neighbors. In many ways, life for the Israelites in Babylon was better than backwater Israel and Judea. It was more comfortable. Sure, it was a house, but it wasn't a home. And our Babylon is not dissimilar at all. I think most of us, what do? We upgraded our Wi-Fi's so it's nice and stable, okay? We bought, in my case certainly, a comfy pair of fluffy slippers, flannel pajama bottoms, and a nice shirt that can wear with a tie or a jacket depending on the Zoom conversation that you're on, right? Is it just me? You know, our homes have become our priority, and it's not surprising. We spent 14 months in them. And we binge-watched The Last Kingdom for the second time. So good. There have been so few contexts for missional living together, missional outreach, teaching, worship, prayer. Few contexts for muscling up and doing things like this, serving one another. It takes muscle and robustness to serve because, man, we do this. We've just had no context to do that. So, you know, our G1Cs, our God First communities, our midweek groups, we've gotten, you know, comfortable. So let's face it, in many ways, we've had it, certainly I've had it, maybe you can relate, self-indulgently good over this period. And we've gotten lazy with the things that really matter eternally. And this previously unimaginable horror of a lifestyle that we now find ourselves in has become the normal life. But we know, and God knows, that although it is life, it is not living. And we might be living in our houses, but we are not at home. God is graciously stirring our hearts and calling us to return home. And we're going to spend the rest of our series answering the questions of what are we returning to? And what are we rebuilding? And so like you, I'm seriously excited about sinking our teeth into that. But the first things must come first for us, God first. It's to allow God to stir us, to be captivated by God's love for us afresh, blown away by it, to be moved by God's love and compassion for others again, the hurting, the lost, the broken people around us. Pain, there's so much pain. To be dismayed again by the state of our villages, our towns, our cities, our nations. And to be compelled by the gospel that is salvation for all of God's precious people. Every one of the returns from exile is based around someone experiencing something of God's heart, his sadness, his heart breaking at the world not being the way that it should be. God lamented that the people had nowhere to worship him together and engage with him. He lamented that there were no godly leaders to lead the charge. So he stirs the hearts of the Babylonian king Cyrus. And he allows them to go back under Zerubbabel and to build the temple. But the temple was and will always be an imperfect model of something greater to come. God lamented that although there were worship rituals taking place in the temple, the teaching of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was not happening, and the people did not know their God. So he stirs the heart of another Babylonian king. It still blows my mind how this happens. Artaxerxes allows more priests and Levites to go back, and temple worship resumes again under Ezra. But the Torah was still an incomplete revelation of God's word, pointing people to a day where the full incarnation of God's word would come. God lamented that Jerusalem, the city of peace, by definition, lay in ruins and was uninhabitable because the walls were broken and it was unsafe. So God stirs Nehemiah and again Artaxerxes, and they go and rebuild the walls and the ruined cities. But walls and cities and jobs and economy and commerce are a pale reflection of the one who is life and is peace. God first, let us allow the great passions of God to wash over us afresh this morning and to stir us to action, stir us to movement. God's passions over the state of the church, his precious people, the bride of Christ. The state of families. The state of our towns and our cities. The desperate sadness of loved ones who've lost people, and who've been suffering physically, medically through this period. The great sadness of people going blind through life, unaware of the love of God for them in the person of Jesus Christ. and sin and death still having its way. Jesus laments. Jesus himself laments over the spiritual state of Jerusalem 450 years after Nehemiah. You'd think after these 3 great returns, things would be in place when Jesus comes back. No, listen to this. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem," Jesus says, "the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Jesus didn't find a great city that had been rebuilt. No, there's so much lacking. And I find it so telling that even after these 3 great returns and 3 great starts, that there are 3 stalled attempts at building something eternal that lasts. Reality is Zerubbabel's best efforts, and Ezra's best efforts, and Nehemiah's best efforts were woefully inadequate. These 3 giants of the faith remind us that ultimately only one person, Jesus, and his work on the cross, and his death in our place, and his resurrected life that is for us a promise and eternal hope. He can fulfill the deep longings that God had when he was calling back these returns, calling back these return moments. Only Jesus is the true and eternal King that Zerubbabel was kind of shadowily reflecting. And only he could lead us into peace. Only Jesus is the true temple who could never be destroyed and in whom God's fullness and presence dwells, right? Only Jesus is the living word, the fullness of the truth that Ezra was painting a shallow picture of when he was preaching out of the Torah. Only Jesus is, or are the true walls, that provide eternal safety, prosperity, and life to his people. The first return, the most important return, the return on which all other returns are to be built, is a return to Christ. We're going to conclude this morning as we take communion together. We break bread, we drink the juice,